I'm going to talk about our security review of ZisK. So, the agenda is what is ZisK, some security properties, some vulnerabilities we found, some thoughts on tooling. This is going to be very, very quick, so if you see something on the slides that I don't cover, or you just want to talk to me about something about it afterwards, I'll leave my details on the screen. Okay, so what's ZisK? ZisK is a ZK VM. It's compatible with 64-bit RISC. Importantly, from our point of view, it's optimized for low latency proofs, which is really good if you want real-time proofing. First big win, it's open source. That means it's transparent, no lock-ins for users, lots of love from OpenZeppelin because of that. But the one I'm going to highlight at the moment is it's lots of well-encapsulated components, which is really useful. So that makes it good for security reviews. Quick anatomy of a ZisK program. So if you start with some program counter at the start, and then you execute a bunch of instructions, and you get to the end, then you have a valid ZisK program. So to make sure we're executing the correct instructions, there's a ROM component. That's a whole separate circuit, and its job is to make sure that every instruction we execute was preloaded as part of the valid instruction. One of those instructions might access memory. There's a separate component to make sure that you're doing that consistently and making sure you're aligning all the addresses correctly. One of those instructions might use a register. We want to have a separate component to make sure that we're reading and writing the latest state. The timestamps have to have a range check, a separate component for that. Once we're sure we're executing the right instruction, we have a separate component to make sure that the execution was done correctly. And as you can see, the pattern here is what we're doing is just breaking it up into all sorts of little components to try and handle each part individually. If it turns out the program itself is just too long, then we just break that into a separate component and then just have a separate point there. So the intuition here about what ZisK is trying to do is that they've broken this into a bunch of different components. Each of these can be proven independently, and therefore the latency goes down because you can do them all in parallel. And then you can get like real-time proving, and that they're really trying to optimize for that. From my point of view, the other thing I'm going to say is this also just happens to be really good for security, because whenever we're reviewing the system, it has very, very clean interfaces, and you can like sub them in and out, so it's really easy that way. So I just think it happens to be a good little... it's a very complicated system that is broken into very simple components, so I think that just makes it really useful. Cool. Let me just go through some of the bugs that we found, just for the sake of it. Some background. If you tried to do a lookup like an XOR, you want to validate that A XOR B equals C. Keep in mind the prover gets to pick all of these, so it's our job to make sure it's consistent. What we do is we construct one of these binary tables where we have all of the possible 1-byte values of A, all of the possible 1-byte values of B, and then the corresponding value of C. And then we just go from least significant bytes to most significant byte, one at a time, just making sure it's all consistent. We have a separate one of those for every single opcode, every binary opcode at least. So the problem here, if we're looking at the less than or equal to opcode, what they were doing was just checking the high byte, which works in most cases, but if they happen to be equal, the actual answer depends on checking the next most significant byte. They were missing that particular check, so we just had to recommend doing a carryover for that. This one's a little complicated to explain. I won't go through it in detail just because we won't have time, but I might just mention that if you're looking at a 32-bit opcode in a 64-bit machine, one question that comes up is, what do you actually count as the high byte? Should I consider byte number 3 or byte number 7 to be the high byte? It doesn't actually matter as long as you do it consistently, but there was like an inconsistency in two parts of the system, and that caused a couple of bugs in this case when you're trying to do that correction. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the carry. If you're trying to add, let's say, A plus B equals C, if you have an overflow in one of the bytes, you need to carry the 1, obviously. Some of the operations have a carry, some of them don't. Sometimes the carry should start at 1, sometimes it should start at 0. The way this is all handled is with this has initial carry flag. That wasn't constrained. So that means that it was always possible to turn the 1s into 0s and 0s into 1s when you're just doing the initial carry. So you get an off by 1 error. There is a slight subtlety with this factor of 2, which I won't bother explaining, other than just noting that it is still possible, even though there's a slight complication there, it's still possible to turn the 0s into 1s and the 1s into 0s. Okay, so a couple of observations. Those first 2 bugs were like logic bugs. And as it turns out, they have a transpiler, where they start with a RISC program, turn it into a ZisK program, and then they just transpile those operations, and they weren't using any of the buggy opcodes. So that was like a part of the reason why they didn't detect those. Those are the kinds of things you detect with the test suite. But the under-constrained bugs are actually harder to detect. They're a bit more subtle. You kind of have to figure them out from either direct reasoning, SAT solving, or some sort of tooling mechanism. Okay, so this is my last slide. I'll just mention that we did experiment some tooling. We used the Z3 sat solver. It managed to reproduce some of the findings and also found a regression bug, was kind of interesting. I would love to be able to do that interactively. Maybe it's already possible. Some people have mentioned a couple of these tools. I personally haven't used them. If you have any insight into that, please let me know. I'd love to talk about it. The last thing I'm going to say is I was on a panel about 4 years ago with being skeptical of formal verification, mainly because people were talking about it for DeFi, and I was claiming it has a bunch of requirements that I don't think DeFi was meeting. But as it turns out, I think it actually does make sense for something like a ZK VM. So I'm actually excited to see that happen. I hope they will do that soon. Cool. Any questions, please hit me up in Twitter or email. Thank you.